This is Talk It Out, the Women's Agenda podcast. Tune in for your weekly download on the latest news, trends and ideas affecting your career or your business. Here's your host, Angela Priestley.
Good afternoon. I am in Angela Priestley's seat today and I am hosting this week's episode of the Women's Agenda podcast. I am joined in the studio today by our publisher, Tarla Lambert.
Hello.
Welcome. And I am joined by Shivani Gopal, who is the Chief Executive of The Remarkable Woman. Welcome.
Hello, great to be here.
It's great to have you back. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit about the subject of bringing your whole self to work and whether or not that is a good idea. And the reason we're talking about this subject is that last week the Diversity Council hosted their annual debate, and it's actually always a great evening. They get two teams of three speakers to argue a certain topic, and Tony Jones is always the moderator, and he actually does quite a good job. He's actually he actually goes really hard on all of the speakers afterwards, which I think is quite something for people to submit themselves to. But this year's topic was whether it's a good idea to bring your whole self to work. And the whole room, there were 460 people, and everyone has a little handheld device. And before the debate starts, you get to answer, plug in your answer to the question. And before anyone had spoken, the responses were in favour of yes. Most people in the room thought it was a good idea to bring your whole self to work. And then by the end of the night, that had actually changed, and 57% of the room ultimately agreed that actually, no, it's probably not a good idea to bring your whole self to work. So I'm interested, Shivani, just to ask you, I'll talk a little bit more about what they sort of said, but what is your take on that, whether it is a good idea to bring your whole self to work?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal topic, and it's one that I also think is fraught with booby traps, all the way, because, what if you're having a terrible day and you've just had a fight with your partner? Are you going to walk into work crying and screaming and all in all being rather disruptive to your co-workers, and that's not good. But from a holistic point of view, I think it's brilliant, and I think, yes, you should bring your whole self to work, and I get why there was this huge audience swing between yay and then majority nay. But let's think about your whole self in the three main domains that we generally live in. So there is our professional selves and us being happy with work. There's us being happy in our personal lives, and that could be your family. And then there's our health, right? So if you think about it in those three main domains, should we bring our whole self to work? Yes, we should. I think it should be within reason. And I think that, and I read the article that you wrote, and I thought it was brilliant, where you commented that it should be within reason of social norms and laws. So of course that is correct. But just think about how much richer workplaces would be if we brought our whole selves to work. And the example I want to give is, let's just say that, so I'm going to have to use a finance example because my corporate pedigree is in finance. You're in a finance role and you've been given the task of either analysing a whole bunch of accounts or actually giving someone advice on their finances. But imagine if your whole self meant that you had this absolute love for art or for photography. Imagine if you brought your whole self to work, how much more powerful you'd be in your communication, your ability to relate to others, if you could bring that part of you to work. And imagine how much richer your employer would be. And I mean richer metaphorically. We want you personally to be richer more so than your employer. But how much richer that workplace would be because you brought all those extra skills. And I think what's missing in workplaces today is the encouragement and the cultivation of whole self. So I think, should we do it? Yes. How do we do it? The beauty of that lies with leadership. And leaders need to get really good at getting vulnerable and talking about their real selves, again, within reason, within social norms and legal obligations, rather. But once they do that, more and more people will be encouraged to bring their whole selves to work and therefore take more risk. You take more risk, you create more creativity, and it feeds more innovation. So I think we're all better off for it.
And that actually was a theme that emerged in the debate, that the more vulnerable leaders are in sort of creating workplaces where it's okay to have made mistakes, to admit your sort of your shortcomings, to be open about any struggles that you've had or you're having, that will ultimately set the tone for workplaces where it is safe to be your whole self. Because that was one of the primary reasons, I think, for the shift in the room, was because are our workplaces safe and accommodating for us to bring our true selves? And the answer is probably not yet, because workplaces are still quite rigid in their expectations of employees. Tarla, I'm interested to get your take on this. Should you bring your whole self to work? Do you bring your whole self to work?
Look, I think that's right, within reason. My friends and family are probably quite relieved that I don't bring my whole self to work, because I am known to be quite inappropriate generally. But yes, I agree with you. I think that within those three domains that Shivani mentioned, we do need to kind of be bringing that in and speaking about troubles that we're having. That doesn't mean that we need to kind of be inappropriate about it and come in and kick up a stink. But I think we do need to be vulnerable. We do need to talk about what's going on. And we do need to be as genuine and as authentic as we can be at work, because it allows everyone else to do the same. And especially if you are in a managerial position, you've got anyone that's under you, they need to know that that's okay and to feel safe and secure to be able to do that. But yes, what about you, Georgie? Do you think that you do?
I think that I probably do, and I think that one of the things that, I started out my career in law, and one of the things that I found uncomfortable working in corporate law was that I didn't actually really feel like I belonged there, and not in a sense, I couldn't really explain it, and it wasn't actually until after I'd left law and started working in journalism where for me it just clicked, and I didn't feel like I needed to hide part of myself. Not that I actually did necessarily hide part of myself in law, but it was a very structured corporate environment there, and I felt that somehow stifling because it wasn't exactly me. But there wasn't anybody sort of beating me over with a stick saying you have to be a certain way. That was sort of my perception of what was expected. And I think that was what was interesting. So all of the speakers at the debate, Lorraine Murphy, who works at NAB, sort of spoke about when she started her career, she felt really like she had to be beige, because that's what sort of leaders, you had to be as beige as possible. She didn't want to bring the fact to work that she's got quite a flamboyant personality, that she's quite open emotionally, that she, loves bright clothes and all those sorts of things, which she's now embraced. And I suppose that's one end of the extreme when you're talking about bringing your whole self to work. And then there are other ends of the spectrum. So Jack Heath, who's the CEO of Sane Australia, was talking about, divulging mental health issues to your employer. And he was the one who sort of made the point that it's actually not safe yet in most workplaces to reveal what you're going through. And he said, that is ultimately something that really needs to change. But is it a good idea to disclose? It would really have to depend on your employer and how that would flow. And then Karen Mundine, who's the CEO of Reconciliation Australia, she was speaking, and obviously she was talking about being an Aboriginal leader in the workplace. And she said, she can't hide the colour of her skin. So she doesn't have the option of, with mental illness, obviously there is scope to mask it. And we know that a lot of people do that. But then there are different parts of sort of who you are and your whole self that you can't hide. And she made the point that, if we do mask the things that we can, it makes it that much harder to sort of to expect workplaces to accommodate difference, because if we do hide who we are, it does make it harder, because it sort of perpetuates this stereotype.
That's why grassroots movements create so much change, because you start to see the momentum, you start to see the sheer math by way of numbers, and the top line change makers being the organisations, the leaders, put in a position where they think, well, gee, I really got to go do something about this now. I need to create some systems, some support structures to support people. But I do think when it comes to things like mental health, I agree that workplaces aren't a safe place for people to disclose it. However, this is why, again, the top-down approach is really important, because people don't have the ability to say, hey, I really do struggle with my mental health. What leaders should instead be doing is saying, we've got the old RDO, if anyone remembers. Is it rostered day off or registered day off?
Rostered day off.
Rostered day off. I haven't had one of those in a very, very long time. But I think a great spin on that would be a mental health day off or an R&R day. And I think that will enable people to go away and rest and recuperate or take a mental health day off and therefore be recharged to be able to bring their whole selves to work. Because again, I think, as with anything, it's a very complicated, layered, many, many shades of grey kind of topic. And it's one where leaders have to go, well, what are the things that we're going to talk about and not talk about? And with mental health, there are even people who suffer from it who have prejudices against it. And it's possibly because, one might have gone through a rather nasty experience as opposed to the other persons they're thinking, I might not hire you because I know how hard it was for me. So protections need to be in place around whole self. But I think the plus side of whole self is, the many other shades of our personality that we can bring. And there are great, personality, tools out there that can help you look at that. So whether it's, McClellan's theory of motivation that looks at how you're motivated, whether it looks at, whether you're right brain or left brain dominant, or whether you look at something as favoured as the Clifton Strengths Finder. But when we're moving away from, and what I would like to see people move away from, is that rudimentary employee approach where you said you're working for a law firm or you're a leader at a big four bank and you think you've just got to be beige. You're thinking, well, if I'm going to bring in colour, what colours am I going to bring in? So you have greater choice to be your whole self. And that's what we're lacking right now. And that's the potential that we, from a grassroots perspective, as well as the leadership perspective, can change.
It's funny, just then, because you talked about sort of looking into tools, one of the speakers was Mary Custis, and she spoke in character as Effie. And I just cannot actually explain in words how funny she was. Every single line of her argument was, because she was also incredibly clever and everything she said. But at one point she said, she said a lot of very, quite funny things, but mostly along the lines of think about how many people at work that you just wish they'd bring a whole lot less of themselves into the workplace, leave a little bit more at home. But she also just said, I'd encourage people to go and speak to someone who can help them get the tools to cope. Don't just talk to a tool. And if you're talking to your work colleagues, chances are they're not equipped to deal with your problems.
So well said.
Yeah, and it was, she is really quite something.
This is a commercial break for Work It Out. We'll be back in a moment. But if you're interested in being a sponsor for Work It Out or Women's Agenda, just drop us a line and let us know. That's womensagenda.com.au.
So part of this, I suppose, Shivani, is another topic that is something you're passionate about, I suppose. And I'm interested to know how this came about. But in terms of, you've been very open with sharing your own personal story.
Yes.
And that can be quite a brave decision. How did you come to that decision? And tell us a little bit about your own personal story.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll start with, how I came to it rather than my story, because funnily enough, as many times as I talk about it, I still, like many people, get that uncomfortable feeling of, oh, gee, I'm going to talk about myself again, and how unfun that can be from time to time. But I started an organisation, as you know, called The Remarkable Woman, and there were a number of premises that led me to starting it, and one of it was the deafening silence of everyday superhero remarkable women. And the thing that really annoyed me was that, you turn on the TV and you'd see, some reality TV stars sharing their views on the world. And that's kind of all we got. Or we got some celebrities who were talking about their viewpoints, whether it was something really challenging like, experiencing an illness like cancer, or something really brilliant like winning an Oscar. But there was these stories from women that we really needed to hear and connect from, because they were the women who were going to help us get out of our funk and get us to the next level. And one of the things that I wanted to challenge was breaking away from the trappings of taboo on what you can and cannot talk about, or the shackles of shame around mental health, struggling with work-life balance, or struggling with, with weight issues and so forth. And I wanted women to feel empowered to do that, but also empowered to talk about their many successes without the tall poppy syndrome, without the imposter syndrome, or the I'm not good enough. So I had said to a friend, well, I'm going to go out and do this, and I'm going to create this platform for women to share their stories. And she challenged me and said, that's a great idea and I love it, start with your own. And I went, oh, no one needs to hear my story. It's all about everyone else. And funnily enough, every time I approach a woman, we host quarterly events called Remarkable Woman Talks, and the premise is for everyday superhero remarkable women to share their stories. And whenever a member of the Remarkable Woman is onboarded, we ask them if they want to share their story. And if they say yes, we'll sort of put them on this, I guess, role list. And when an event comes up, we'll call one of them and say, hey, do you want to come up and do a story? Without an exception, every single woman has said yes. And then when we've called them up and said, do you want to share your story? They've said, oh my God, I've got nothing to share. I've got nothing to talk about. So holistically, I'd love the idea of saying something, but I have nothing of value to share. So of course we know that's wrong, and we tend to doubt ourselves. So I had to really push myself out there and share my story. To show that, yes, we all do, and we all go through this feeling of I have nothing of value to share, but yet people learn and they synthesize from it. And I think storytelling is so important because it's why, books are so dear to our hearts, right? It has the ability to inspire, it has the ability to change people's lives, but it has the ability to connect with people in a whole different way because you start to see yourself in the main character and you start to relate to them and you start to think, if that happened to me, what would I do differently? Or how would I do the same? And it can be a very powerful synthesizer for creating change in your life. So for me, my story and my norm is coming from Fiji, my parents coming out here on business visas and setting up a number of different restaurants, and it's growing up in restaurant kitchens and packing takeaway bags and running the till when I was old enough. And it taught me that taking a risk and building a business was very normal. So it was no surprise when I threw away the lucrative finance gig and started up my own business. But it also meant that I came from a rather patriarchal community, and within that community, having a boyfriend is very much a no-no. And when I did, like every other patriotic Australian girl as you do when you're 16, 17 and you have a boyfriend, I was sprung in a rather a funny kind of way where the auntie and uncle quite literally saw us as we were going up the escalator, and it was one of those moments where you're like a deer stuck in headlights and you go, do I run? Do I stay? Do I duck? And as much as I want to make it sound like hilarity ensued, it really didn't. I mean, what turned out to be he and I both wanting to just continue our relationship ended up being, well, the both of you need to get married, and so we did. And
you were 16.
So I was 16 when I was sprung,
discovered.
but not 16 when I got married. We had a sort of a confirmation ceremony where it's decided that you're going to be married, and that happened when I was 18. Actually, before I turned 18, when I was 17. But then we staggered out the engagement and the wedding. So by the time I got married, I was 20. I got divorced at 24, and the story that I share is, for me, I didn't feel as though I had any option to leave because my community is so patriarchal, or at least I thought it was. I ended up being the change maker for that. And I thought there was nothing I could do to change my circumstances. And I realised that my financial security was my life raft to change. And so I started to go out there and talk about it. And it was so uncomfortable, but as uncomfortable as it was, the amount of lives that I've touched and inspired and changed, and the change that I'm creating in my community is tenfold as a result, where women come up to me and say, my parents have actually read about your story, and they say, you actually don't need to feel any pressure to marry your boyfriend anymore, because we get that these things can go wrong and it's probably not the right thing to do. But equally, it's educating women around the importance of financial independence. So I think that no matter who you are or whatever you've gone through in life, I think it's so important that you share it, because people can relate and you will inspire other people and you will help them make meaning of their lives and change their lives for the better if you do. So you've just got to get out of your discomfort and do it.
How difficult was it for you sort of extracting yourself from a marriage when you knew that your family was so invested culturally in that relationship?
Yeah, it's so difficult, and I really like how elegantly you put that, because they were invested culturally and socially in the marriage. Because in Indian culture, a wedding is actually, it's a lifetime bond for 7 lives. In Hindi, you say Saat Janmo Ka Saath, which is a 7-life bond, because, of course, we believe in reincarnation. And but also it's a societal thing where there's so much shame in getting a divorce, and it doesn't just impact you, it impacts your parents. So there's a lot of Bollywood movies where, if a woman does get divorced, her parents, the line they say is, we'll have to walk with our heads hung in shame. We can't enter the temple anymore because what are we going to say? So there's a lot of that going on, and popular culture does have a huge influence on the way that people, see themselves and the way they conduct their lives. So it was incredibly difficult, and it was initially baby steps. And then I felt like there was this earthquake that just created this huge rupture in my family between me and everyone else. So the first 12 months, the relationship was incredibly strained. When I look back on that time in my life, I always say that it was soul-destroying. And I believe in the dark night of the soul, or being a phoenix and rising from the ashes because of that time in my life, because I know that you can repair from it, but not just me, my family too, because they've gone on this beautiful journey with me where they have now understood that being divorced, being an Indian divorced woman, isn't the end of the world. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There's a new life at the end of the tunnel. Of course, I've remarried. I've married a wonderful Australian man who, hats off to him, is also a feminist. So that works out very well because, of course, I'm a feminist and we don't argue about our political beliefs. But, they've really embraced that. And if I had said to them 10 years ago that this is what we were all going to go through as a family, they wouldn't have believed me. And they would have done everything in their power to make sure that didn't happen. So it's it was really, really difficult, but I guess I had to do it for the greater good of knowing that I was more than likely statistically going to live a long life, and so I had to be invested in my own happiness.
I think it's even just sitting here now listening to this, and I have read before and I've heard you speak before about your own story, but I'm struck by how powerful it is to hear when somebody changes their life like that, because I think it's possible, and I can see why for so many people who do listen to you, particularly who come from similar cultures or backgrounds where they can relate to sort of the parental expectations, is that you can read academically about why, female empowerment matters.
Yes.
But I think it's when you actually listen to someone's experience and you hear how that sort of lack of empowerment impacted them and then how they've sort of been able to change their life. I don't think there's anything as powerful as that.
As powerful as the story.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
No, it's true. I was at an event last week where Linda Burney spoke, and she said a similar thing about how, and I think actually women are more prone to this as well, of this kind of, I guess this default position of thinking that we're not worthy and our stories aren't worthy and that we shouldn't share them. And she was speaking about how, women should really reclaim their own stories and to start sharing them widely because they do make such a difference. And she shared a couple of examples of women she'd met and who had these, phenomenal kind of pasts, but had come to her being like, oh, your story is so amazing. I wish I had something to share as well. And when she teased it out with them, of course they did. But yeah, I think it's exactly right. Like that's the point of connection with people, and just, the human condition is such a powerful thing. And if you can kind of connect with someone through that medium, it's invaluable, I think. And something like that, I come from an Indian background as well. I mean, my background is slightly different in that my grandmother was the matriarch, and I think she had a very strong wish to kind of move into Australian culture and to really become ingrained in it, and to take that on and in a lot of ways kind of cast off cultural social pressures as well, cultural pressures rather as well, but my grandfather is a Hindu, and I think he still kind of grapples with that, even though my mum and her siblings grew up in Cronulla and they all married Australians in the end. I think it is something that still plays in his head. And even when I have had dinner with him last night, and he'll still, make comments about when I'm going to get married. And I think for him, he really needs that security. I mean, I've been with my partner for 6 years, but for him, he needs to know, that I'm going to get married. And I do feel that pressure even as his grandchild. I feel that pressure that I want to do that for him before he passes away. He's 88 years old, and that weighs on people. And I think
and you're always changing your identity in the way that you live.
Yeah.
Because of cultural pressures. And I think this is why it's so important for you, Tarla, to share that story and the pros and cons of which way you're thinking about moving, because so many women feel that pressure. And it may be to get married, it may be to have children before a certain time because grandparents and parents, but the impact that it puts on you more particularly than your partner. Is far more felt.
That's it. And I think because you might have an internal struggle as well with what you want. I am not opposed to marriage, but I'm certainly not that, I'm not that kind of phased about it either. If it happens, it happens. And I kind of don't want to get married at the moment because I, have different things going on, and I've just bought a house, and, I'm loving my career, and I just feel like I don't have the time to focus on that right now.
Yeah.
But, that pressure still exists that, should I be doing that? And my grandmother passed away earlier this year, and even though I don't think it was as consequential for her, I still felt, so sad that I hadn't been able to kind of give that to both of them. So it's an interesting one, and this kind of plays out through generations, I think. But I completely agree. I think, it just takes that element of storytelling and people coming forward and sharing what they might think are insignificant stories to really make a difference.
Can I just add one thing around storytelling? And I've been pondering this over the weekend because it seems to be that's what I do on a Sunday. I think when we share stories and when, you do, particularly the work that you do at Women's Agenda and you're publishing all of these stories about successful women who are going through challenges, what you're doing is you are creating norms. And what we don't have right now is the norm of a successful woman in various industries. We don't have the norm of women being successful in sport. We don't have the norm of women going through something incredibly challenging and coming out on top, bouncing down again, and then coming out on top all over again. But we do have those norms for men. And it's for that reason that when we see a woman do very well, we're both surprised and happy at the same time. And what I look forward to is a time that we're no longer surprised, it's just expected. And that we don't need to talk about quotas, we don't need to talk about targets, because it's just the norm. Right? It's the reason why we don't distill these issues with men, because it's just what happens. And storytelling, as much as it inspires other people into action, as much as it empowers people, what it also does is it starts to create patterns, it starts to create norms. And when something's normal, it's the most powerful way to create change. If you think about the human behavior change model, you can incentivize someone to do something. So just like your grandfather in a rather sad kind of way is incentivizing you to hurry up and get married, or you could be punitive, right? And you can say, well, if you don't do this, there's going to be, this compliance issue. And that we see that a lot with quotas, right? Quotas that you're going to have a punishment if you don't meet it. But the most powerful way to create change is just that this is what happens, this is what's normal. And the example that I talk about with norms is going to a temple. So if you've ever been to Asia or India and it was your first time and you go to a temple as a person from an Anglo-Saxon background, I didn't know you had an Indian background, Tarla, but what you would do is instinctively is you would look at what everyone else is doing and you take off your shoes and you'd bow your head because it's normal, it's what everyone else is doing, and you follow suit. Norms change behaviours, it can change the world. And I think that's why storytelling is so important, because as an extension, it'll do just that.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point. Thank you both so much for today. Before we finish, I would like to ask you both for recommendations, as we always do. something that you are reading, watching, thinking about doing. A few weeks ago, I suggested Lego as a great recommendation for children, and I was widely panned for that.
I can imagine.
Tarla, the pressure is on today for you to recommend. Tell me something good that I should be reading, watching, doing.
Well, I recommend that you don't go to Kmart right now because it's a pain in the ass.
Oh, yeah.
I went to try to find my nieces and nephews' presents on the weekend, and it is already manic.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Okay, I
Stick
won't
to
go.
online shopping.
Yeah.
But in terms of a recommendation, a favourable recommendation, I went and saw Hannah Critchlow speak at the Institute of Managers and Leaders forum in Sydney last week. And she's a Cambridge neuroscientist. And her insights are so phenomenal. She looks at, the anatomy of the brain and how that influences your capacity to lead, and speaks to very particular traits. And she is just so dynamic and really engaging. She's still in her 30s. She's phenomenal. So I would recommend that everyone picks up her book. I think her first one's called Consciousness, and then she's also releasing one this year, or next year rather, on the science of fate. So that would be my recommendation.
Oh, the science of fate. I'm hooked.
She's known as, she's becoming known as the female Brian Cox, which will enthuse Angela, who,
definitely
she is his
possibly
number one
his
fangirl.
Yes, absolutely. And what about you, Shivani? Have you got anything to recommend for us?
Yes, I do. I've been thinking about this long and hard, as you both know, since we started this podcast. I have, I think, just a few weeks ago finished Sabrina. The
Netflix one.
Yeah, the Netflix one. The adventures, the creepy adventures, the dark adventures. Goodness, I've got it wrong. But if you just go onto Netflix and find Sabrina, you'll find it. It's utterly brilliant. I also got my husband into it. We binged it together, about 2 or 3 episodes at a time. Really well done. There's a lot of talk around whether it was positive feminism or negative feminism. Either way, what it shows you is a woman who builds a lot of power, and with a lot of power, you can either use it for good or for evil. And it's questionable whether she uses it for either. I think she sort of used it rather recklessly. Recalcitrant is the word that I would use. I mean, if she was your 16-year-old, you want to discipline her and put some guidelines around the do's and don'ts. But it's the makings of a woman who is experimenting with the do's and don'ts of power and morality, and I think it's very well done and incredibly entertaining.
That's
fantastic.
good to know.
Actually,
I've come across that one, and I was a little bit questioning about whether I'd like it or not. But
I've seen a lot of positive feedback for it I feel like on Instagram, people are posting about it a lot and loving it. My recent favourite viewing on Netflix has been Marcella, the UK detective series. It's really, really good. So I definitely recommend that. I don't know why I love crime series.
I love crime
Police,
too.
Stop. I just can't get enough of it.
I know, it's
I don't know
becoming
whether
a bit sick between.
They must be terrible people.
That's what I think, but I really enjoy that, so I would definitely recommend that. And that's all that we've got time for this week. Just a reminder that you can get a hit of Women's Agenda in your inbox every day, Monday to Friday, just before lunch, womensagenda.com.au, and you can sign up to our newsletter. Have a look. We've always got great news for women, what's happening in the world of work, politics, sport, and more. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, girls.
See ya.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for Talk It Out, the Women's Agenda podcast, powered by Eagle Waves Radio. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and jump on the website for more amazing shows. Catch you next time.